Good afternoon and welcome to Falling Walls Conversations. I'm Charlotte Stoddart. I'm a science filmmaker and podcaster, making content for Nature and other science magazines. And today I'm the moderator for this conversation with Professor Londa Schiebinger. We'll meet you in a minute, Londa. First, a few technical notes for our audience who've just joined us. This is a 25-minute conversation, and you're encouraged to ask questions and join in the conversation. So if you have a question at any point, you can let us know by clicking on the raise hand button in Zoom, and then one of our technical people will spotlight you, which means that you've been selected to ask the next question, and then I'll let you know when it's time to speak. If you'd like to ask a follow-up question, you can click on the raise hand button again. If you've got technical problems, you can let us know in the chat and we'll try to help you. This conversation is being recorded and will be available on the Falling Walls website after the summit. Professor Schiebinger, thank you for joining us. Professor Schiebinger is Professor of History of Science at Stanford University. She's also an international expert on gender analysis, which is a subject she's spoken about at the United Nations and at the European Parliament. Professor Schiebinger, when you talk about gender analysis, if I'm right, you're not talking about gender equality issues in the workplace. What you're talking about is the way in which scientific research itself and technologies themselves can be biased towards one sex or another. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I like to, of course, we support gender equality in the workplace, but shall I say more importantly, very importantly, we need to look at how science is done, not just who is doing the science, but how it's done. And everyone can use sex, gender, and diversity analysis to make the products, to make the medicines, to make everything that is the results of science work for everyone across all of society.
Could you give us an example of how scientific research or a technology might be biased?
Well, I think the best known example, and I'm sure the viewers already know this example, 10 drugs were withdrawn from the US market, and 8 of those had worse consequences for women. Not only do these drugs cost billions of dollars to develop, and therefore this is an economic drain when they fail, but when they fail, they cause human death and suffering. Now, why did the drugs systematically work worse for women? One thing is that in drug development, you start with the mice and the rats. And until very recently, those were primarily male animals. So if you test only on male animals, you don't see anything unique to the females, and you don't see how that drug metabolizes in the female body. So this is very important. In response, funding agencies have taken action. So our National Institutes of Health, since 2016, have required that if you would like public funding from taxpayer money, you must make sure that your research will work equally for everyone along the lines. And we could add to the gender aspect, we could add the racial and ethnic aspect. We have to make sure that our products and drugs work for everyone.
Why is it historically that most research has been done on male animals and tested in male human subjects as well?
So it's sometimes called pesky hormones. The rats have an estrous cycle, and we human females have a menstrual cycle. And the idea is that we're more variable than males, so they want to test on the most solid, robust subject they can find. Well, it turns out, so a good friend of mine from Berkeley Irving Zucker has overturned this research to show that males are equally variable on different aspects. In fact, they're not as regularly variable as we are. Now, I would like to ask, if the menstrual cycle is important, shouldn't we be testing for the menstrual cycle. I think we found out that the vaccine can bring on women's periods. So if you're on birth control pills, for example, and aren't menstruating, then surprise, because I think no one was told, it can induce your period. So we really need to know if drugs are safe for, in this case, women across the menstrual cycle.
And do you think that that is happening generally now? You mentioned one funding body that's requiring this in the research it funds, but more broadly across the world, is this happening?
Yeah, so also the European Commission now asks that sex and/or gender and intersectional analysis be done by default. So if you're applying for European Commission funds, you need to address these issues, or you need to say they aren't relevant. So if you do mathematics, you do theoretical physics, no one is asking for a sex analysis. As far as I know, black holes have no sex. So we do it where it's relevant and where it's important. So even though now many funding agencies are asking for sex or gender analysis or diversity analysis, we aren't looking necessarily at the menstrual cycle. Now, we've had a really interesting paper to show how the menstrual cycle can be important. If you're using nanomedicine to treat cancers, in this case it was breast cancer and ovarian cancer, if you administer the nanoparticles at a certain part of the estrous cycle, it will improve the treatment. So if women, well, I actually forget what it is, but it works very well for ovarian cancer. It brings the particles to the cancer and treats it better. It doesn't work so well for breast cancer. But I think we could use the menstrual cycle as a strategy for helping with particular diseases.
That's really interesting. And we've talked a lot about sort of medical research, but this potential bias can creep into all different kinds of areas, can't it? Also, technologies, algorithms. Could you give us another example that's from quite a different area?
Yeah, I'll take, a lot of us drive cars. So I'll take cars as an example. So crash test dummies have been based on the male body, the medium-sized male body. So if a woman has an accident, women are 47% more likely to be injured in a very small accident, even if they've equalized for weight and for all other, everyone's wearing their seatbelts, because the crash test dummies don't model the female body. And it's not just height and weight. It has to do with ligaments. There are more neck injuries. So we need to get this right for everyone. And we need to, it's not just women, obese men or heavier men also have more injuries from accidents because the weight isn't distributed in the way that the average male model would predict, and so they tend to slide under the seatbelt. So we just need, it's 2021. I think we're smarter than that. I think we can make cars, something like cars that we've had forever, very safe.
Do you think it's just been that the people who are doing the tests have been sort of blind to the diversity of people who drive cars? They've just been testing on people who are like themselves, and they haven't really even realized that they've been being biased. It's been unconscious bias.
Well, most bias is unconscious bias. But these days, I teach courses on gendered innovations all the time. If you've come through Stanford, you've probably run into these kinds of ideas. I think more and more we are training students correctly so that when they go to industry, they understand better. So I would expect, now, crash test dummies are very expensive. It's not just a question of being aware. We also have to make it a priority and put our funds where we think social justice lies.
When did people start paying attention to gender in research and technologies? It sounds like this is something you've been thinking about for a long time, but is it quite new that that research institutions and technology companies have been aware of this problem?
So Yes, I have been working on gender in knowledge production for many years now. It was part of my PhD dissertation. But it is a somewhat new topic. But as I say, people are becoming more and more aware. But then we now have all of this AI, and it seemed to be a surprise to people that there's bias, in AI. So it seems that we need to be specific for each area. And if we look at something like facial recognition, when you open your phone, that's facial recognition. It sees who you are. And we use this sometimes in airports now. It's very commonly used. But we see that facial recognition doesn't work for Black women. In fact, there's a professor at MIT, and she develops facial recognition, but for the program to recognize her, she had to put on a white mask because she's a Black woman. And she then studied, this is Joy Bolamwini, she then studied this issue and found that facial recognition has only a 1% failure rate for white men because they're in the training data, but for Black women, there's a 35% failure rate. So here we see the intersectional kind of analysis looking at both gender and then also racial or ethnic attributes.
Thank you. Before we continue, I'll just remind the digital audience that you can ask Professor Schiebinger a question at any time by clicking on the raise hand button in Zoom. When you become aware of some of these biases, do you ever approach the researchers or the technology companies and make them aware of the way that their product is biased? And how do they respond if you do that?
Well, in 2012, I discovered that Google Translate has a masculine default. So I went to Madrid. I was interviewed by Spanish newspapers. I don't read Spanish, so I zoomed the articles through Google Translate, and they referred to Londa Schiebinger. He said he thought, and occasionally it wrote. And I thought, oh, I have spent my entire life becoming an intellectual being, and now I am defaulted out to become a male. That means that articles about me put more data into the database that connects he or a male attribute with thinking and writing and speaking. So we went to Google and we said, do you know? And they said, really? We had no idea. And so then I had a workshop. I run a lab called Gendered Innovations, and we work on these kinds of methods, sex, gender, and diversity methods, in order to improve things, to innovate. And so we invited Google and then some of the Stanford natural language processing experts to a workshop, and they said, oh, we can fix that. Well, now, if I put the same article back through Google Translate, it's not fixed. Google has made some incremental changes, but the problem is that sometimes when you've set a platform, it's much harder to correct it than it is to make it perfect or better from the very beginning. So we're encouraging companies and all researchers to consider these aspects at the beginning of the research process and not to launch something into the public space and then have to go back and iterate. That's a waste of money. I would sort of like to know how much money this has cost Google in a way, because I would seek out a different translation system. I think theirs is the best, but we would like to have that corrected.
Why might something like Google Translate have this bias towards men in the first place? Why might it have been developed in that way?
Well, the problem, almost all the problems with bias in AI, in machine learning, have to do with the data set. And this becomes extremely important when we're thinking about health data. So there's a study of Parkinson's disease, and they collected data from like iPhones. But when they looked at the data set, there were only 18% women in the data set. That means that the machine will learn the characteristics of Parkinson's disease, but it will then be male characteristics and not the female characteristics. So it's very important that we get the data sets right. And people have been working on this. There's something called data sheets for data sets. And this allows people developing a program or programming robots, whatever it is they're doing, to scrutinize what is in the data set so that they can balance that data set.
I see. You mentioned that you first started working on gender analysis when you were doing your PhD. And I imagine at that time maybe this wasn't a subject that was talked about much. So how did you come to the subject and end up doing a PhD in it?
Well, you couldn't do a PhD in it. There wasn't an it in the 1980s when I got my PhD. So how did I come to it? I guess there were no women professors to study with at Harvard in my day when I did my PhD. And I think I wondered, what would the world look like if there were women who were developing history, or women who were professors? And this led me to look at bias in knowledge, and then I wanted to do something positive, so I turned it around to gendered innovations. How can we harness the creative power of gender analysis to discover new things? And this I've been doing since 2009.
So if we're going to talk about it in that from that positive angle, how do you sell gender analysis to companies? Because I guess if they're set in their ways, doing it the way they've always done, it can be a bit expensive and inconvenient for them to change what they're doing and incorporate gender analysis. So how do you sell it to them as a positive thing?
Well, I think that companies understand that they want customers, they want users, and they realize they're missing a market segment. So it's really that, and once you call it innovation, gendered innovations, I was very clear that I needed some title that actually showed the positive aspect. People are on board. They want to know, oh, how can we use this tool to develop something new? How can we use it for discovery?
You mentioned the history of science just now, and you're professor of history of science at Stanford University. And I guess I'm curious about how gender analysis fits into a history department, and why you're in the history department and perhaps not in, I don't know, a science department.
Oh, I see. Well, I think I like history of science because you can do science at a distance, if you want to say. So I collaborate all the time with computer scientists, with engineers, with people in the medical school. It's really a lot of fun. I don't get stuck in one lab. I can have this bird's eye view. So history itself is a discipline that, as I said, had almost no women professors when I started. And it's very interesting that as women came into the field, we're just about to publish this paper, we developed new subdisciplines in history. So there wasn't something called gender history when I went through, but there now is very well-recognized field of gender history. We developed history of the body. Everyone had been doing intellectual history. I was an intellectual historian. Well, what about the history of the body? We are human beings. We developed the history of sexuality. And lots of different things. So not only did we move into history, but we changed what the field studies. It's really much more interesting than you think.
Tell me a little bit about history of the body. That's not something I've heard about before.
Oh, well, I was interested. I wrote an article, for example, why mammals are called mammals. Now, have you ever considered why you are in this natural classification, Mammalia?
Something to do with the mammalian glands?
Yes, well, there you go. So for thousands of years, we were called quadrupeds, so four-footed animals. And one day, when I had my first baby, it was my first day out to the library, and I was reading Buffon, who's a famous 18th century natural historian, and there on the page, I'm being called a quadruped, and I said to the page, no, I am definitely a mammal. I can tell you I am a mammal. I am nursing this baby. And so I looked into the history of it. This is the history of the body. And I discovered that, in fact, it was part of a political struggle in the 18th century to get women to stay home and nurse their own babies. Women had been using wet nurses, especially elite women would not nurse their babies, but give them to a woman in the house who did that for them. And so it was part of the political struggle to find women's place in democracy as mothers and wives in the home. And this category of biological classification became part of that. So that is the kind of history of the body that fascinates me.
That's fascinating, and it's a history that the male professors had not even thought about.
I don't think
looking
so.
into before. Before I ask another question, we'll just check if there are any questions from the audience. You can click on the raise hand button in Zoom now if you do have a question. I think you've mentioned, Professor Schiebinger, both sex and gender, and I wonder if you could explain the difference between those two terms and why the difference is important.
Yes, it's very simple. So sex is about biological characteristics: height, weight, hormones, genes. Gender is much more complicated. It's about social attitudes and behaviors. So we as women are expected to look a certain way. There are gender norms. There are rules in society about how we should look and act. But then there's also gender identity. So we can push back against those norms and perhaps create for the younger generation new norms. And there's also gender relations. That is how people of different genders interact. And so this is what we mean by gender and sex.
And when someone is thinking about a research project or a technology, how do those the differences between those two matter?
So you have to decide if it's a physical aspect you're going after, like the crash test dummies. That's all a sex difference, right? It's not how we prefer to drive a car. It's how our bodies are protected in a car. But something like, let's take social robots, maybe the kinds of robots that are to help kids with autism. And here's where gender comes into play. Roboticists these days tend to design to the stereotype. So let's say it's a nursing robot. So elderly people may need assistance from a nursing robot. Because 90% of nurses are female in the United States, do we then create a female-looking, a woman-type robot? Will the patient comply better to the nursing robot's request to take a medication or to continue an exercise? But as soon as we build these stereotypes into the robot, we're reinforcing those social stereotypes, those gender stereotypes. And in this case, it would mean that many men who might want to become nurses are blocked yet again because we have this very strong notion that proper nurses are women. So this is the kind of gender analysis we do.
It sounds like we've come a long way since you did your PhD, and there, this wasn't really even a field of research or discussion. What stage do you feel like we're at now? Are most research institutes and companies aware of gender analysis issues, or not yet?
I think we're at a very good place, but we aren't there yet. So, as I said, a lot of the funding agencies, such as the European Commission, the German Research Foundation, many funding agencies are beginning to ask for this so that researchers have an incentive to learn what it is because they will want funding in their field. And universities are becoming more aware, so they're including it more and more into university courses. We still don't have gender analysis or sex analysis in core engineering courses where they need to be, like mechanical engineering for car design or something like that. Computer science classes are becoming more aware because they've seen the social harms that AI can do. It can do great social good, but it can do social harms. And most people want to do the right thing. And then at the very end, for the researchers, peer-reviewed journals are beginning to incorporate these things into their guidelines as well. So Nature, for example, has wonderful guidelines asking for sex and gender in the research if it's relevant.
That's good to know. Professor Schiebinger, we've come to the end of our time for this conversation today, so thank you very much for joining us. For those of you on Zoom, if you stay on the line, then we'll have another conversation starting in 5 minutes' time with Mark Ferguson.